Most of the historical plans to restore the Roman Empire placed their authors as the new Roman emperors. From Charlemagne to Mussolini, the wannabe restorers envisioned themselves at the helm of the Rome reborn, basking in all the glory and prestige that comes with it. But there is one particular restoration plan that stands out. It's comparatively pragmatic, not overly ambitious, and doesn't even put the planner on the empire's throne. This unique plan is known as the Greek project of Catherine the Great. The 18th century was the time of Russian ascendance. The country entered the 1700s as the backwater of Europe. Its access to the Baltics was blocked by the powerful Swedish Empire. To the west was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, ever eager to challenge the Russians for dominion over the lands along the Dnieper River. To the south, the Black Sea was more of an Ottoman lake. Its southern shores were controlled by the Sublime Porte directly, while the northern banks were the domain of its vassal, the Crimean Khan. But in the first half of the 18th century, Russia has gained an upper hand over 2 out of 3 of its major rivals. Sweden was decisively defeated in the Great Northern War and effectively ceased to be a great power. Poland was neutralized through diplomatic influence, to a point where Russian rulers had a final say in electing the next Polish king. The remaining big target was the mighty Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans were no longer as mighty as they were at the time of Mehmed and Suleiman. The empire wasn't the sick man of Europe yet, but it started showing some signs of weakness. Ever since their defeat at the hands of the Holy League in the Great Turkish War, the Ottomans were struggling to reassert themselves on the European stage. The Janissary loyalty was declining, the revolts were springing up in the provinces, and the newly resurgent Persia was threatening the eastern frontiers. However, the Sublime Porte was still a force to be reckoned with and possessed the biggest army in Europe. The first round of the Russo-Turkish Wars in the 18th century ended inconclusively. The sum total of Russian gains on the Black Sea was the fortress of Azov, and even that one was forbidden from being fortified by the treaty signed in 1739. When Catherine II ascended the Russian throne, the empire's progress on its southern strategic goal was fairly unimpressive. But the new Russian empress herself, on the other hand, was very impressive. Catherine, born Sophia Frederica Augusta, came to rule Russia after overthrowing her unpopular husband, Peter III. The imperial couple were both German by birth, but unlike Peter, Catherine embraced the faith and customs of Russian people, which earned her the support of both the populace and the nobility. The new empress was ambitious, energetic, and well-educated. Her ascension marked the beginning of the Golden Age for the Russian Empire. Catherine's reign started with a diplomatic victory in Poland. In 1764, the empress managed to get her former favorite, Stanisław Poniatowski, elected to the Polish throne with the backing of the Russian army. The Polish nobility were split in their support of the new king. The cornerstone of the disagreements was the dissident question, the issue of the rights of non-Catholics within the Commonwealth. Russia and Prussia were pushing for more rights for the Orthodox and the Protestants, while France and Austria were opposing this reform. In February 1768, Russian ambassador Nikolai Repnin forced the Sejm to pass the Religious Tolerance Act in exchange for a constitutional guarantee from Catherine. This triggered a revolt from the part of the Polish nobility in opposition to the king and the Russian influence. With the diplomatic backing of Austria and France, they formed a confederation at the town of Bar, near the Polish-Ottoman border. The heavily outnumbered Confederates couldn't withstand the combined forces of the king's loyalists and the Russian army, and were desperate for foreign support. Austria and France weren't eager to join, so the only option on the table was the Ottoman Empire. In June 1768 of the same year, the fortress of Bar was taken by the Russian forces. When the defeated Confederates fled across the Ottoman border, the Zaporozhian Cossacks followed in pursuit and created a diplomatic incident. Egged on by the Austrian and the French envoys, the Sultan used this as a pretext to imprison the Russian ambassador, which amounted to a declaration of war. But the war did not go the Sultan's way. He and his ally, the Crimean Khan, could field bigger armies, but they had nothing to answer the superior artillery coordination of the Russians. On land, the Turkish forces suffered a series of defeats, and lost several key fortresses. At sea, the expeditionary fleet of Alexei Orlov reached the Aegean and destroyed the entire Ottoman force sent to stop him in the Battle of Chesma. For the next 4 years, Orlov's force became a nightmare for the Turks. They blocked the straits, sparked revolts in Morea, Egypt and the Levant, and even managed to capture Beirut. Austria's entrance into the war on the Sultan's side might have turned the tides, but Katherin managed to secure the Habsburg neutrality with the first partition of Poland. By 1774, the war situation was hopeless for the Ottomans. The Treaty of Küçükçayırcı that ended the hostilities marked a major blow to Turkish influence and prestige. At the same time, this war was a huge victory for Russia, despite it being started by the Ottomans. The Empress broke the Sultan's stranglehold on the Black Sea, gaining 2 coastal outlets at the mouth of the Dnieper and on the Kerch Peninsula in Crimea. The Ottomans had to renounce their suzerainty over the Crimean Khanate and to allow the passage of Russian ships through the straits. This privilege was also extended to the Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, who could now sail under the Russian flag and enjoyed the protection of St. Petersburg. These included the Moldavians and the Vlachs in the Danubian principalities, and most notably, the Greeks. The Greeks played a unique role in the war. I have already mentioned the revolt in Morea, sparked by the arrival of Alexei Orlov and his fleet. This was one of the major events of the war. It distracted the Ottoman forces and helped the Russian army advance on other fronts. The Orlov rebellion was suppressed after a year of fighting, but it succeeded in establishing diplomatic connections between the Russian imperial court and the Greeks of the Peloponnese and the Aegean. During the war, Alexei Orlov even established a so-called Grand Duchy of Archipelago, a semi-official state consisting of 18 islands, with its own laws, tax code and school system. In the following years, thousands of Hellenic immigrants moved to Russia, and many prominent Greeks assumed offices in the imperial administration. This created lines of communication, which provided a significant strategic advantage. Russia could now foment unrest in the Orthodox regions of the Ottoman Empire more easily, in case of another confrontation with the Sublime Porte. And such a confrontation was sure to come. Catherine's ambitions far exceeded a couple of ports on the Black Sea. Without direct control of the straits, Russian shipping and trade could never be fully secure. With the first phase of the southern thrust now complete, the Empress set her sights on the Bosphorus. But the role that the Greeks played in Catherine's plans wasn't purely geopolitical. Catherine's reign was also marked with a fascination with Greek culture. The Empress was a woman of the Enlightenment, and like many of her friends, loved classical antiquity. The Greek influx into the empire played well into it. Many Hellenic scholars and artists were invited to the Russian capital to share their knowledge and skills. Russian architecture and art of this period were inspired by Hellenistic and Byzantine traditions. Many cities founded in the newly acquired territories were given Greek names. Kherson was founded in the mouth of the Dnieper, bearing the same name as the ancient Greek colony, where Prince Vladimir received his baptism, starting the Christianization of the Rus. The Crimean trading port of Kaffa was given back its historical name Theodosia. Colonies with names like Mariupol, Stavropol and others sprung around the Azov Sea coast and the Pontic steppe, and became the new homes of many Greek immigrants. This Greek naming fashion even found its way into the Romanov imperial dynasty. The first grandson of the empress was named Alexander. In her correspondence, Catherine revealed that his name was inspired by both the Russian warrior saint Alexander Nevsky and the legendary king of Macedon. Russian poet and senator Gavril Derzhavin composed a poem in his honor called "To the Purple-Born Child of the North," purple-born being the ancient epithet of the Byzantine emperors. Catherine's second grandson's name was chosen to be even more conspicuous. "They asked me who's going to be the godfather," writes Catherine in her autobiography. "I said only my best friend Abdul Hamid can fit this role. But since it's improper for a Turk to baptize a Christian, at least we can honor him by naming the baby Constantine." Constantine was an unusual name for a member of the Romanov dynasty. but it was the most popular name of the Eastern Roman emperors. For the Greeks, Constantine was the name of both the founder of Constantinople and the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI. The reincarnation of the Marble King was fabled to herald the restoration of the empire. Of course, now the city of Constantine was ruled over by the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid, whom Kathrin mockingly calls "my best friend" in her notes. Young Constantine Pavlovich was slated to receive a Hellenic upbringing. Even his wet nurse was a Greek woman. At the feast celebrating the birth of Constantine, the choir sang songs in ancient Greek to the guests, many of whom were foreign dignitaries. The only more obvious way to signal the intention to take Constantinople would have been to say it out loud. The foreign diplomats, however, weren't too enthusiastic about Catherine's ambition. Sweden and Prussia were wary of the growing Russian might. Other European powers might also have had something to say about the unchecked expansion in the Black Sea region. But despite these concerns, the empress thought that the time was ripe for such an endeavor. The attention of the Western Europe was focused on the American War of Independence. The Great Britain was trying its hardest to put down the revolt of the 13 colonies, while France, Spain and the Netherlands were working to make it even harder for the Brits. The Prussian king Frederick II was getting old and would not intervene on the Sultan's behalf without strong Western backing, according to Catherine's estimation. Plus, the Empress had just found a willing partner for her plans at the court of Vienna. But why would the Austrians be willing to ally with Russia? Wasn't Austria just recently trying to foil Catherine's plans in Poland and egging on the Ottomans to declare war on Russia? The reason for this pivot was the change in Austrian leadership. The previous head of the Habsburg family was Maria Theresa, and she wasn't overly fond of Catherine's Russia. She viewed the Orthodox Empire as a competition and still held some grudge over the Russians quitting during the 7 Years' War. But the mother-in-law of all Europe was getting older and was transferring more of the imperial responsibilities to her son and successor, Joseph II. Joseph had another vision for the future of Russo-Austrian relations. For him, Russia was a valuable partner in dividing the spheres of influence. In 1772, Joseph lobbied the Austrian entrance into the Tripartite Pact to partition Poland, and he remained in correspondence with Catherine ever since. It did not take long for them to find a common ground on the Eastern question. In 1780, Joseph and Catherine met in Mogilev to discuss their shared vision for the future of the Balkans. In November of the same year, Maria Theresa died, and Joseph assumed full control of Austrian foreign policy. In 1781, the alliance between Russia and Austria was formalized. The Ottomans now had to be on guard against both the northern and the western neighbor. To finalize the plan, Austria and Russia needed to determine who gets what in case of a victory over the Turks. Bickering over the spoils was the last things the Allies needed to distract them when the war would come. The Grand Chancellor of the Russian Empire, Alexander Bezborodko, presented Catherine with a memorial on political affairs, a document outlining the totality of Russian foreign policy. Among other things, he included different scenarios for carving up the Ottoman possessions in Europe between Austria and Russia. If the war between the Allies and the Sublime Porte would be going with moderate success, wrote Bezborodko, then it may be prudent to offer the Sultan peace on modest terms. According to these modest terms, Russia was supposed to get the Crimean Peninsula and all the lands and fortresses east of the Dniester, while Austria was to be given back their former possessions in the Balkans, ceded by the Treaty of 1739. In addition, Bezborodko proposed the creation of a buffer state on the Danube. This buffer state would have been formed out of Moldova, Wallachia and Bessarabia, and would be given the name Dacia. Essentially, this would have meant creating Romania some 80 years ahead of schedule. However, Bezborodko also had another plan. Here's what he wrote on this topic. But suppose the stubbornness of the Porte on one hand, and our successes on the other, would offer ways for the annihilation of Turkey, and the restoration of the Greek Empire with your Imperial Majesty's grandson at the helm. Here we'd also need to determine the exact borders of the empire beforehand, assigning them in the Turkish possessions in Europe, as well as in the islands of the archipelago. We'd need to assume that the court of Vienna would like to have some privileges for their Mediterranean trade, that England, France and Spain may also demand some concessions, that the Republic of Venice would present their claim on Morea, which we shouldn't give them but better substitute it for some islands. It may be that France and Spain would intend to take ports in Egypt or elsewhere on the African coastline, for which we shouldn't be objecting much. The Empress evidently liked her minister's work. In a letter to Joseph II sent on the 21st of September 1782, she relayed his plans almost verbatim. The only difference for the first variant was that she didn't mention the fate of Crimea at all. Catherine planned to annex the Khanate before going to war, and didn't want to ask Joseph's permission to do so. Other than that, every point in Catherine's moderate variant goes in accordance with Bezborodko's memorial. The ambitious variant followed the Chancellor's outline as well. In case the two empires managed to expel the Turks from Europe, Catherine proposed the revival of the ancient Greek Empire, with her 3-year-old grandson as its emperor. Constantine would renounce all his claims on the Russian throne, and his empire would remain neutral in all affairs concerning Austria and Russia. Funnily enough, Constantine wouldn't have become the youngest Byzantine emperor, even if the whole thing happened the next day. The record of the 2-year-old Michael III was very hard to beat. According to the plan, Constantine's Neo-Byzantium would get the Ottoman possessions in Europe and the islands of the Aegean. To appease Joseph, Catherine gave him a carte blanche on drawing the new empire's western border, so that the Habsburgs could claim as much of the Balkans as they wanted. On the 13th of November, Joseph sent Catherine a response. He did not object to the creation of Dacia and the Greek Empire, but he wanted to get a whole bunch of stuff in the Balkans: Hotin and Moldavia, Nikopol and Bulgaria, Belgrade with parts of Serbia, Albania, and just the whole of Bosnia. According to his plan, the border between Austria and Byzantium south of the Danube would be one of those classic straight lines, like the ones you see on the map of colonial Africa. Surely drawing a straight-line border in the Balkans wasn't going to create any problems in the future. To add to all those gains, Joseph was also planning to annex Istria and Dalmatia. The fact that Istria and Dalmatia were owned by Venice and not by the Ottomans didn't bother him much. He proposed to reimburse the Venetians by giving them Cyprus, Crete, Morea, and a couple of random islands in the Aegean. Truly, Joseph II was a geopolitical genius ahead of his time. Sadly, we'll never know what Catherine and her ministers thought of Joseph's visionary plan. The two monarchs never mentioned the issue in the mutual correspondence again. You can see that the point of contention between the plans of Bezborodko and of Joseph was Morea. Bezborodko was staunchly against giving it away to anyone except the restored empire, while the Habsburg wanted to use it as a bargaining chip in his own negotiations with Venice. Morea was the heartland of the Greek independence movement, so Bezborodko's stance on this question was much more reasonable and informed than what Joseph proposed. But even if they'd managed to polish out the details, the Austrian ambitions were disproportionate to their abilities. Plus, the perfect diplomatic conditions to put the plan in motion were quickly disappearing. The American War of Independence was winding down, and in January 1783, France, Spain and Britain signed a treaty to end the hostilities. Catherine suspected that France was rushing to defend the Ottomans from the combined Russo-Austrian threat. The opportunity for an aggressive move was gone, so now the planners had to bait the Turks into declaring war themselves. The biggest test for the Sultan's patience came in 1783, when Russia annexed the Crimean Khanate. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca guaranteed the independence and neutrality of the Khanate, but in reality it remained a diplomatic battleground. Both the Russians and the Turks were spending a lot of money and resources to get their preferred candidate into power, and both were accusing each other of interference. In 1783, Catherine decided to flip the board, intervened in the ongoing civil war in Crimea, and just annexed the peninsula into Russia. The Sultan didn't take the bait immediately, but in 1787, when the Empress went on tour around the Crimea, the Ottomans started issuing protests and demanding the restoration of the Khanate. Emboldened by the promises of backing from France and England, Abdul Hamid once again declared war on Russia. For Joseph and Catherine, this was the best chance to implement their designs. However, while the Russians were again victorious on both land and sea, the performance of the Austrian army was less than stellar. The Austrians failed to make any significant progress, lost a number of battles, and when Joseph II died in 1790, sued for a separate peace. The Russian army was advancing, but the Ottomans offered significant resistance, so the progress was slower than Catherine desired. Still, in a couple of years, the Turkish military was on its last leg. However, by this time, major Western powers like Prussia and Britain had started gathering forces to save the Sublime Porte from a complete collapse. The Austrian alliance should have been a precaution against this turn of events, but the Habsburg military had turned out not to be up to the task. With outside pressure mounting, Catherine decided to quit while ahead and be satisfied with some limited gains. The Ottomans were forced to recognize Crimea as the part of the Russian Empire and cede the lands east of the Dniester with the valuable fortress of Ochakov. The Russians secured all the lands they wanted for themselves, but no independent Byzantium or even Dacia were on the agenda this time around. The chance to revive the medieval Roman Empire on the Bosphorus was gone. With the ideas of the French Revolution sweeping across Europe, restoration of old empires was falling out of fashion. It is interesting to theorize what this Neo-Byzantium of Empress Catherine would have looked like. The information we have about Catherine's knowledge on the topic may give us some idea. The Empress was a big Roman history fan, but quite like most of the modern-day Romaboos, she was more interested in the classical empire rather than all that Byzantine stuff. Most historians just assumed that her plan was supposed to be a revived Byzantium because it would have been a Christian empire centered on Constantinople. But Catherine doesn't use the word Byzantium or Byzantine even once. She just calls it the Greek Empire. Catherine's idea of the medieval Roman state was a mix of knowledge about Greco-Roman antiquity and the old Russian image of Byzantium as the source of the Orthodox Christianity. The Empress loved Roman history, but only the fun parts. She read Polybius and Plutarch and even helped to translate a French book about Belisarius, but did not bother with any ancient sources on the laws and the administration. There were no books on Byzantine ceremonies and political structure in Catherine's library, but there was Procopius' Secret History, because that stuff is fun to read. The same applies to the culture and customs. Among other things, Catherine revived the old Roman tradition of victory titles in the Russian military. Her star generals and admirals had received the special award for the most impressive victories, like Suvorov of Rymnik, Potemkin of Tauria, and Orlov of Chesma. She thought that this had been a persistent tradition in Roman history, going back all the way to the likes of Scipio Africanus, but in reality it's been abandoned after Heraclius, with few occasional exceptions. Catherine even wrote a historical play called The Early Reign of Oleg. One of its episodes describes the Russian prince's visit to Constantinople, and it's full of anachronisms. Emperor Leo entertains Oleg with classical Greek theater and Olympic Games. It's not quite Netflix Cleopatra level inaccurate, but would have still warranted a full-length debunking video. On the other hand, the Empress seems to have known a lot about the Varangian Guard. She had started to read Gibbon, but got bored by his Decline and Fall around volume 8, right at the beginning of the Byzantine era. All this reinforces the notion that Catherine only cared about the cool bits of Roman history. This knowledge disparity isn't surprising. Catherine, like most of her learned friends throughout Europe, valued classical Rome and Greece very highly. Many of them were excited to see their fellow enlightened monarch topple the decadent Ottoman Empire and establish a haven for classical culture in its place. Even Voltaire was cheering her on to restore the Greek Empire, probably more due to his dislike of the Ottomans, rather than his love for Byzantium. The medieval Eastern Rome, on the other hand, was only interesting to the Empress from the perspective of Russian history. She didn't commission any research into the Byzantine society for her Greek project, even though there were plenty of experts at her disposal. It all probably means that Catherine's Greek Empire would have been less of a revived Byzantium and more of an 18th century enlightened despotism with some Hellenistic flavor. The Greek project of Catherine the Great did not pan out the way that the Empress wanted. Her grandson never sat on the throne of Constantinople. After Catherine died, and the turbulent years of the Napoleonic Wars had passed, the Russian emperors did not give up their struggle for influence in the Balkans. But in keeping up with the times, their new Balkan initiatives were driven more by popular principles like ethnicity and religion, rather than old dynastic claims. The 19th century Tsars positioned themselves as the protectors of the Slavs and the Orthodox people, so trading the lands of the Serbs and the Bulgars from one empire to another could not have been their policy. In 1780, Catherine II was content with giving all of Serbia to the Habsburgs. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas II had to decide what to do about the Habsburgs trying to annex Serbia, and we all know how that ended. Catherine's Greek project has a peculiar legacy. On one hand, it was an opportunistic plot to carve out buffer states in the Balkans, which was abandoned as soon as its parties got distracted by more important events. On the other hand, the Russians have succeeded in establishing a geographical, diplomatic, and cultural connection to the ancient cradle of their faith. The settlements established in those decades still stand today as the big urban centers of the region, populated by the Russians and the Ukrainians, but bearing the same Greek names. It also turned out to be a major influence on the Greek independence movement, so while the stated geopolitical goals were not completely met, we shouldn't be underestimating its long-term effect by the lack of a flashy triumphal procession through the streets of Constantinople. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions left on the topic, feel free to put them in the comments. I'd like to give special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Mulai Cherkawi, Conventus Orbis, Picamis, Mikius Porcius, and others. And to the rest of you, thanks a lot for watching to the end, and I will see you in the next one.